All right, so welcome to my PhD dissertation. This is a fun moment for me. It feels like simultaneously a very long time, but also a very short time. I think I've had the pleasure of doing some really exciting research, and time just flies, I guess, when you do what you're really enjoying. And I think that is the best way I can sum up my PhD. It's just that I have found an area of work and of study that I find really fascinating and enjoyable, and I feel privileged to be standing here in front of everyone and being able to talk about the work that I've done. And to sort of go over a little bit of a summary of what that work includes, I've worked on a number of papers over the 2-year course of my PhD towards the end of my master's. And a couple of these were sort of independent projects that I started in Thomas's lab, but I very quickly found a lot of open science collaborators in the Medical AI Research Center. And so some of the work that we're talking about today is sort of done in collaboration with those people. So I'd like to sort of preliminarily acknowledge that many of the contributions of this work were collaborative, and that sort of I didn't get here on my own. But of the couple of papers that I've published during my research, we're going to primarily focus on 2 today. And these are the 2 that primarily focus on mental images as a field of study. So I guess before we get started, we might want to define some terms. So when we talk about mental imagery, I think everyone has an idea of what that means, but I think it's helpful to first define it. So we're going to define mental imagery as any perceptual representation that is not directly triggered by sensory input. So if it's a thing you're perceiving, but it didn't come from your eyes, that's a mental image, which notably differentiates it from vision and other perceptual modalities, which are typically heavily conditioned on signals from your retina when you are using your eyes. And maybe to get a feel for that, we can do an exercise. So I want everyone on Zoom and in the audience today to memorize this image of a surfer. I can give you a few seconds to look at it, but I think the fun part is that I want you to now imagine the image, projecting it into this empty space. Where is my slides? Why is it not working? There we go. So you can project the image of a surfer into this empty space. And during this exercise, I sort of want you to feel how your mental image sort of is present in your conscious experience. You can sort of note how it was different than seeing the surfer a few moments earlier. It might be fuzzier, less vivid. It's clearly a different type of representation than seeing is. And what we can do here is just appreciate how tremendously interesting what we just did is. I mean, the fact that your brain is able to generate signals entirely independent of your external world and create, using nothing but a recollection from your short-term memory, a very self-contained experience of that visual stimulus. And of course, also there's a wide variety of mental images that were generated in the audience today. I think everyone has their own experience of how strong their mental image was, how vivid it was, the specific details it had. But they were all clearly driven by this image of a surfer that I've presented on the screen. And so they're clearly all related in containing sort of that underlying semantic representation. So the core question, I think, of my talk today is, how can we study these mental images? If they're all contained independently in our private conscious experiences, can we externalize them? Can we study them? Can we bring them out into the external world for at least that underlying semantic content that is sort of independent of everyone's individual experiences? Can we bring that to light and into a field of study? So I think we can imagine a number of ways that a technology that could do that might be useful. We can imagine patients with traumatic brain injuries who are unable to communicate with the external world. There are 50 million unresponsive patients who suffer traumatic brain injuries every year. And there's a couple of studies that predict that somewhere around 15 to 20% of these people are exhibiting levels of consciousness that are not readily apparent just by trying to interact with them behaviorally. And we can sort of discuss that, or we can look at that through brain scan. We can see that their brain is doing things under the surface, even if they're not communicating externally. And so if they do have these sort of private conscious experiences that are rich and that are containing interesting content, just like you and me and all of us, then if we could access that, if we could affirm consciousness, that might actually help provide diagnosis or a tool to communicate with these people. Because right now, 70% of these patients die in the hospital from being taken off of life support. So there's also a number of other applications. I'm sure we can imagine better ways we might communicate with ourselves and with each other through being able to communicate and deflect many of the internal representations that are hard to communicate in language. There's also a number of mental health disorders that sort of are afflicted by unwanted or disruptive mental imagery, things like schizophrenia, anxiety, even some cases of depression, dissociative identity disorder. Many of these disorders manifest primarily as changes only in private conscious states. And so if we want to access these states, to study them, to be able to understand them and treat them, then having an access to these internal representations would presumably be very useful. So what can we do here? There obviously is a wide variety of emerging technologies as well as sort of existing technologies that are helping facilitate the research I've done today. But ultimately, my goal is to work on the modeling side, to build algorithms that can decode a patient's mental state, and specifically mental images, from their subjective content using non-invasive functional magnetic resonance imaging, and hopefully being able to give doctors and researchers a window into people's subjective experiences. So to talk a little bit about what that means, I think we first have to understand a little bit about fMRI. And fMRI is a critical tool for this research. It allows us to extract complex and spatially precise measurements of the blood oxygenation present in someone's brain. I'm sure you can imagine that when someone's brain is consuming a lot of energy in a particular location, it pulls more oxygen from the blood. And so we can use this measurement of the hemodynamic response, as we call it. You can actually measure which areas of the brain are being most active. And the video you just saw sort of is a representation of how we scan that, where we can take a person's cortical surface, the surface of their brain, and we can sort of unfold it into a map of data. And that map of data is very responsive to visual stimulus. This is an animation showing if you present sort of this pinwheel spinning diagram, you can see the activation in the cortical surface of the voxels of blood oxygenation sort of lighting up as the area of cortical stimulation, or as the area of retinal stimulation sort of propagates across the cortex. And that's very intuitive, right? We can see a spinning wheel in the stimulus, and we see a spinning wheel in the brain activity. But the fact of the matter is it's not always that simple. And if we start to look at complex images of natural scenes and of our everyday lives, it becomes a lot less obvious what's happening. So for example, the brain activity patterns on the top row are different repetitions of someone viewing that same image of a cat, whereas the brain activity patterns on the bottom row are of them viewing different images. And the thing to take away from this, I guess, is that they're not that different, right? There's a lot of variance in brain activity, even when the stimulus is the same. So it is a little bit difficult, just from an interpretability standpoint, to understand what's happening in all of that data. And so that is why the work that I'm doing here today is sort of valuable in the contribution it's bringing to the field, is where we have to use advanced modeling techniques to understand the richness of this data and to try and decode what it actually contains. So step one of this research, can we decode scene images, right? So putting aside mental images for a moment, if we take subjects and we put them in an fMRI scanner and we show them images on a screen, that activates the same area of the brain that a mental image does. It has different properties between scene and mental images in terms of the strength of the signal in the brain regions, but it is generally activating the same region, and these types of modalities have overlapping representations. So what we can do is we can take a subject and we can put them in the scanner, and we can show them tens of thousands of images under an fMRI scanner. And doing this allows sort of a data-driven approach for us to use machine learning approaches to decode and reconstruct the images that people were seeing in the scanner. And this is a very popular area of research ever since the natural scenes dataset came out a few years ago. And models like MindEye2, which is a paper I contributed to, are currently producing almost near pixel-perfect reconstructions of scene image accuracy, which is already very impressive, right? I can take nothing but a pattern of brain activity and I can reconstruct this very rich visual stimulus. But these approaches are typically not available for mental image decoding, at least not up until now, because of primarily a lack of large-scale data sets. So as I mentioned, the natural scenes data set is the primary driver of all of this data-driven sort of scene image reconstruction work. But there is no natural scenes data set for mental images. And that is the case for a couple of reasons, but the biggest one, I think, is just that fMRI scanning is very expensive and it's very hard. And especially for mental images, as we all saw earlier, it's hard to generate them consistently and quickly and reliably. And when you start to talk about a single person generating tens of thousands of mental images, I'm sure you can imagine the experimental difficulty. So while efforts are certainly underway to collect such data sets, they currently don't exist. And so we have to start with vision as a starting point. So to give some background as to how some of these methods that we're going to build off of for scene image decoding work, we can go through a typical sort of formula of a decoding pipeline. And they typically look something like this. First, we show a human a bunch of images under the scanner, as we said. We then train a neural network to map from their brain activity patterns to some features or just embeddings that are produced by a deep learning model that contain some information that is encoded about the image. So the two that are on the screen are CLIP, and CLIP stands for Contrastive Language Image Pre-training. It is essentially a vector that is learned to align images and text. And what that produces is sort of an embedding space that contains a lot of semantic information, right? Did the image contain a cat? Did it contain a dog? How many people were there? Things like that are typically contained in this CLIP embedding. Whereas the VAE stands for Variational Autoencoder. This is an embedding that is trained to downsample images to smaller latent representations, and that typically gives you a lot of information about the structural content of an image, right? Where were the objects? How are they spatially positioned? What colors were they? And so we can decode both of these embeddings here, which were produced by a frozen deep neural network that we can pull off the shelf from existing research. That's what the snowflakes mean. But we can train our brain activity to map to these embeddings using a neural network of some kind. And then after that, we can pass these embeddings through a diffusion model. A diffusion model is an image that is trained to take embeddings like the ones we just discussed and invert them back into images. This is probably something that you have all played with to some extent using sort of the broad swath of AI image generators that have come on the market in the past couple of years. Things like DALL-E, Stable Diffusion. ChatGPT just came out with a new image generator built into ChatGPT 4.0. All of these things are using a very similar framework. But instead of using text as the prompt for these, we're going to skip that representation and we're going to go directly to these embeddings that contain all of the information about what the subject was seeing. So yeah, the diffusion model then creates reconstructions. And these are typically very accurate if you compare them to the ground truth images in terms of both the semantic information that we contained in that CLIP vector and the structural information that we contained in sort of the VAE embedding. And we get reconstructions of a clock tower, right? So if the subject sees a clock tower, we can reconstruct a clock tower in approximately the same orientation. Plane to plane, bicycle to bicycle. So this has become extraordinarily effective in the last year or two. It was really, we had decades of research that were reconstructing sort of blurry blobs. And then in the span of like a year, we went from blurry blobs to pixel perfect reconstructions with the advent of all of this deep learning technology. And so part of the advancement was first the natural scenes data set of just becoming able to do a data-driven representation of all of this modeling. But also it was these advancements in generative AI that have really powered a lot of this field. So how can we use this to study mental images? So to get some background, these are flattened cortical maps like the ones we saw in that initial video, with the brain activity highlighted from seeing images on the top and the brain activity from imagining images on the bottom, with the signal to noise ratio indicated by that shade of purple, so how strong a signal is. And the fact that there's measurable signal in the same areas of the brain from seen and mental images sort of indicates that there's a lot of overlap and that that might be promising for decoding these mental images. But I'm sure you can also see that there's a crushing drop in SNR, that the strength of the signal is just much weaker when we're observing and measuring mental images. And that's obviously a modeling challenge because now the data that we're trying to decode it's fuzzier, right? It's not quite all there. Much like our conscious experience of a mental image, or at least for most people, how it is fuzzier and sort of less distinguished than a seen representation, we also see that reflected in the brain activity itself. But what we can do is we can translate a lot of the advancements that have happened in seen image decoding to this through the shared overlap of these representations. Now, decoding approaches typically look something like this. So we'll first have the seen image decoder as we discussed above, and we'll train it to map to seen images. But when we want to actually decode the mental images, we will replace the brain activity pattern that we would have measured from someone was seeing the image, and we will instead give the model a brain activity pattern recorded when someone was imagining a corresponding image. And we can then use the exact same model that's frozen, as you can see with the snowflakes, to sort of perform this reconstruction process, even though the input has fundamentally changed. And that produces some very interesting results. And there have been a number of approaches that have tried things like that. We call it cross-decoding, where you train on vision and then you do inference on mental imagery. And there's a number of data sets and research efforts that have tried things like this over the years, but they've all been fairly limited in terms of scale. From 2019, there was the Deep Recon data set that had a couple of thousand images and some mental imagery trials of some simple shapes and some more complex images as well. And you can see people did cross-decoding of mental images, and you get sort of this very disturbing looking jaguar, right? And the reconstructions from this phase were not yet taking advantage of all these advancements in deep learning, and they weren't yet taking advantage of the scale of vision data sets that we've since had access to with the natural scenes data set. But you can also go back even further to see people reconstructing imagined faces, letters, blobs. This is a well-established sort of practice and field of study of translating these models between scene and mental images. But the work that we're going to talk about today was the natural scenes dataset imagery data. So we call it NSD imagery. It is an extension of the natural scenes dataset, which is the big one that we trained all the vision decoders on. But this time, the same subjects performed mental imagery trials. And this happens to both be attached to the largest vision dataset, so it's helpful for translating the best models, but it's also the largest dataset of mental images that exist right now. And so we're going to use that dataset for our research. And to explore this in more detail, we're going to tackle a number of interesting research questions today. We're going to address a set of unknowns in the field. The first question that we're going to say is, given that the rise of generative AI in the natural scenes dataset has significantly powered advancements in vision decoding, how well will this new sort of suite of models translate to mental images? We also want to know whether, as the fidelity of our reconstructions get better, whether we will start to be limited by the fidelity actually in the data of the mental images themselves. If people have difficulty sort of generating very complex mental images, will that start to be a decoding bottleneck on our reconstruction performance? And lastly, we also want to know whether continuing to power large data sets like NSD and other vision decoding data sets in the field, whether research on that and in building better and better vision decoding models, whether this work will translate to better mental image decoders, which is what we really care about in this work and might be the type of research that really translates to a lot of the downstream applications we talked about. So that's our docket for today. And we can start just by talking about the NSD imagery dataset a little bit more. So in this dataset, we examined the same 8 subjects of NSD, and we had them complete a set of vision trials and imagery trials on the same stimuli. So we want matching vision trials just to have a comparable baseline for how well the models are generalizing, not only to mental images, but also to new samples collected in sort of the same new scanning session. And so we have 18 stimuli of complex images, which are things like the donut, as well as simple stimuli, which are these bars and crosses. And then our final stimulus type was evaluating what we call conceptual stimuli, where instead of showing people a word, or instead of having people imagine sort of a memorized image, we have them memorize and imagine sort of a target concept. So instead of showing you an image of a banana, we would just say, imagine the concept of a banana. And so it's less constrained. So first, we can sort of show a grid of reconstructions on those baseline vision trials just to get an idea of how well the models are generalizing to the scanning session. And for the most part, these reconstructions are largely matching the performance of the original data in the natural scenes dataset, with the maybe notable exception that the simple stimuli are out of distribution for the sort of natural image prior that our models have learned. And so what we get for those are typically very structurally accurate reconstructions, but with seemingly nonsensical semantic details that the model has hallucinated. But yeah, these are methods that were trained only on natural scenes, so that's sort of a fundamental limitation of our model and of this cross-decoding approach. But for the imagery reconstructions, at a glance, these appear definitely qualitatively worse than the scene image reconstructions, given the much lower SNR measured, but quite impressive. And this figure obviously can be hard to see, so maybe we can zoom in a few. These are a selection of some of the best reconstructions of those simple stimuli. These are reconstructions of mental images. And reconstructions are pretty faithful to the ground truth orientation present in the images, although we do typically struggle with the crosses on these accounts. And some of the best complex stimuli reconstructions display broadly correct semantic image categories with information that is clearly reflecting the underlying content that was encoded in those mental images. Now, there's obviously weaknesses in these where it's struggling sort of with the river and with the type of animal for the bird, maybe. But on the other hand, these are images that contain distinct representations of decoded imagined content. We are literally reading the subject's mind. And in this case, there's also things to be happy about. I mean, we get the pose of the surfer quite close. We have 2 very distinct sort of boat-like objects on the water, and multiple pastries for the donut image. These are generally very good, and the models are also clearly generalizing between the scene and mental image cases here. For the conceptual stimuli, it's a little bit harder to measure because, of course, we don't know what the true mental image that the subject was imagining is. But we can see sort of broadly interesting reconstructions. The stripes one has a very abstract image containing stripes. The banana is starting to resemble a fruit. And the zebra has sort of a reminiscent horse-like object. So it's picking up some information, but there's also clearly room for improvement in these initial sort of off-the-shelf reconstruction models. So that answers our first question here, is we can sort of clearly see that the models are generalizing, despite being trained exclusively on vision data and sort of having the brain activity patterns swapped out with this related but very different type of input. And we can see that they're generalizing robustly. And moving on to our second question in our docket, we can examine our reconstructions with a type of human behavioral experiment to sort of examine the differences between these simple and complex stimulus types more closely. Now, to probe this a little bit, we first asked human raters to identify which of two reconstructions on the screen was more similar to the ground truth image, with one of the images being an actual reconstruction of that center stimulus and the other one being a reconstruction of a different random stimulus. So maybe we can all do this together. I think which one of these looks more like the ground truth image in the middle? Maybe we can raise hands for left, raise hands for right. Yeah, that one wasn't very hard. Yeah, this one's clearly identifiable as some kind of donuts or pastry, and we asked humans to do this many, many times to sort of get a score of how often people were able to identify these. We can quantify this by doing a cumulative distribution plot. So the colors on the lines here represent different types of reconstruction. So blue, for example, is the reconstruction of the complex stimuli that were seen as opposed to imagined. And that's obviously the best in this plot. We want lower and to the right is better, lower area under the curve. And so for the blue line, that's our best performing case. That's what the models were trained to do. It has the highest quality data. That's not necessarily surprising. But looking at the other curves, we can see that complex mental images, the red line, also do quite well and are nearly overlapping with the green line for simple seen stimuli. And so what does that tell us? But the simple stimuli are doing a lot worse. And the complex mental images are actually outperforming the simple stimuli in the case of this analysis. So what I want you to take away from this analysis is essentially that the models we're using are generalizing better to mental images than they are to the simple stimuli, which are out of distribution. They don't lie on sort of the natural image pool that the models were trained on. And so that tells us, in a sense, that the most important factor for constraining decoding performance is not whether the SNR of these mental images is high enough, but it's whether your model was actually trained to reconstruct the type of stimuli that you care about and that you are evaluating. Yeah, so that, I guess, brings us to our last research question for just this first section of my talk, where we're going to examine the relationship between the seen and mental image reconstructions a little bit more closely. So this experiment was a little bit different. It asked human raters to rate on a continuous scale how similar reconstructions of both a seen and a mental image were to a ground truth image. This allows us to compare sort of the relative performance of these two plots and get a measure for how much worse mental image reconstructions actually are. So we can also, this one's a little bit harder to do live, but I'm sure we can imagine that a typical response might look something like this, with maybe the image that actually captured the subject's faces being a little bit more highly rated. Now, to examine the results of this experiment, we can plot the average sort of similarity score on the y-axis. The x-axis of this analysis plot represents the similarity scores for the vision reconstructions, while the y-axis is the scores for imagery. All of the dots here are different reconstruction methods, and the larger dots with the bolded points are the average, and the smaller ones are sort of the individual sample reconstructions. So what we see in this plot is we're looking for slopes to have we're looking for the lines to have a larger slope, which would mean better generalization between seen and mental images. And so what we see here is just that there is no sort of clear trend between vision decoding performance and mental imagery decoding performance across methods, by which I mean that there's the 4 bolded points in the middle, and they're not in a line, they're sort of in a cluster. And that tells us a little bit about what these models are actually doing. Because, for example, the MindEye2 model we talked about earlier, which is currently the state-of-the-art vision decoding model, the purple dot, it does very well on vision reconstructions, but very poorly on mental image reconstructions. It isn't generalizing. And so that tells us a little bit about how we're going to move forward in this field, because there's clearly a trend in the samples as the sort of average slope of these lines is all positive, but the methods themselves are not correlated between them. So answering our last question for this first talk, across the stimuli, the models are generalizing better. If the seen image reconstruction for a particular image is better, then the mental image reconstruction is probably also going to be better. But between methods, it's not guaranteed that the best seen image reconstruction method is going to be the best mental image reconstruction method. So knowing that limitation, what can we analyze about existing methods? We see that the methods like brain diffuser, which was the green dot in the previous point, was our best generalizer as far as the methods that we applied to this data. And it produced state-of-the-art reconstructions on our mental imagery data set, despite being an older model that isn't necessarily as advanced as many of the newer models like MindEye2. But looking at sort of how it works, we see that it is a very simple model. It's very robust. It uses a linear regression mapping to map the voxel activations to the feature embeddings that we use to reconstruct. And it also uses multimodal image embedding. So what that means is that it's not only using information encoded in images to do its reconstruction, it's also using information encoded from the text captions of the stimulus image. And that sort of changes the representation of the information it's decoding a little bit in a way that might be helpful. As we showed before, MindEye2 is not doing very well in this analysis, despite doing very well in vision. And so looking deeper into its architecture, we sort of get a little bit of a hint as to why. It's a much more complex and large architecture that has many disparate components that sort of need to be finely tuned on the data set. It also uses very large image features that contain a ton of information in these embeddings to reconstruct scene images, which works well when your scene image data in the brain contains lots of signal. But when it's applied to mental imagery data with sort of much lower signal-to-noise ratios, it breaks down. And it doesn't do very well on imagery data. And knowing that, we can sort of make the hypothesis that these choices are potentially overfitting to the scene image data seen in the core natural scenes dataset. So the next question in the second half of my talk is going to primarily focus on the question of, can we do better and how? So first of all, can we improve reconstructions on mental images at all, sort of by tailoring the architecture to both what we know about mental images and what we can observe about how existing methods do on this data set? Our second question is going to be exploring in more detail sort of which architectural decisions are most impactful and what the optimal mental imagery architecture might look like. And our last question would be to explore in a little bit more detail what the role of the image generator is in this process, because as we saw previously, there's sort of a lot of hallucination happening in this process, and we want to really know how much of the reconstructions are actually from brain activity and how much are being sort of pulled from the knowledge baked into these diffusion models and hallucinated during the inference phase. And then our last question is going to be, how limiting is the quantity of data for current models? In other words, can we collect more and more data to continue improving these, or do we need a new paradigm? So to answer these questions, me and my collaborators within the Medical AI Research Center, we built a method called Mirage. This method is informed by all of the analysis we just went through, sort of elaborating which of the methods do well in imagery and potentially exploring why. And from all of those analyses, we designed our model to respect two sort of desirable criteria, two desiderata. The first is to design our model in a way to where it would be robust to the massive drop in SNR between scene and mental images. This is a transformation that we know is going to happen during the inference phase, so maybe we can design our model to be more robust to that transformation when it happens. And the second criteria we're looking to optimize for in our design is to align the representations that our model is decoding to the information that might be encoded in brain activity. As we sort of saw at the beginning of this talk, your conscious experiences of mental images, and by extension, the signal that is actually encoded in your brain activity, it's a lot less spatially precise. It's fuzzier, it's less well-defined, it's maybe higher level, it's maybe semantic more in nature when compared to the same representations of scene images. So knowing that there's a representational shift in the type of information being encoded, can we adjust our architecture to account for that and to improve performance as a consequence? So to do this, we've designed our model to use a simple ridge regression mapping method. So this is the same type of decoding approach that was used in the brain diffuser method. And we use that primarily because brain diffuser did so well, but also because intuitively we know that robust and highly regularized linear models are one of the best ways to overcome shifts in data like this and are sort of well proven on studying brain activity in these fields. Our model especially uses a small image embedding as this clip vector that we talked about at the beginning. That's this intermediate representation. We saw in MindEye2 that if you have that vector be large and very rich and contain a lot of sparse information, then it can be hard for the model to decode and fill all of that detail when you give it a brain activity pattern that just contains a lot less information. So if we use a smaller image embedding, what we do is we lower the ceiling on the potential performance that our model might be able to reconstruct. But in exchange, we also raise the floor in the sense that this embedding is easier to predict. The quality of our text embeddings that we use for multimodal guidance to try and capture some of these higher level semantic features that might be encoded in mental images is also one of the things we focused on. So to do that, we wanted to really increase the quality of this text training data that our model is learning. And so to do that, we used a synthetic caption generator. It's called Lava. This is what's called a vision language model. It takes images and produces captions of those images. And this generally produces captions that are of much higher quality than the ones that humans were able to generate in the original data set that we use. Our embedding, or our model also decodes as sort of an extra embedding that corresponds to a hidden layer clip image embedding, which is a mouthful, but all you need to know about that is that it's, again, a much larger embedding, but that we aren't using it to drive the generator. So the fact that it is poorly filled and a little bit sparser actually doesn't matter. And we're going to use the information encoded in that to do a retrieval step that we will talk about in a minute here. The inference phase of our model, though, is really where all of the interesting stuff happens. And this figure is very dense, so give me just a minute to sort of walk through it here. But on the left, we see the same experimental protocol we've discussed, where subjects are imagining images under fMRI. And the bridge regression model that we trained in the previous stage is now frozen. So we're doing inference on mental imagery now as opposed to training on scene images. And we're going to use those regression models to predict all of the stuff we just talked about. In addition to the semantic embeddings for clip image and clip text, we also have this sort of VAE latent on the bottom, which is going to provide some of that structure that we talked about. And all of this is going to be passed through a set of generative models. The sort of structural VAE embedding is first going to be reconstructed into this blurry image that contains maybe some of the structural layout of the original decoded image that you're trying to reconstruct. And we're also going to boost that with a set of image filters just to make it come through a little bit more clearly in the final reconstruction. And then our image and text semantic information that we encoded in clip is going to be used along with that sort of blurry images to generate what we call a retrieval pool. So this is a pool, in this case, of 16 images that are, we could think of them as candidate reconstructions that the model might like to output as for what was originally encoded in brain activity. And then we're going to use that hidden layer embedding we talked about a moment ago to pick which of these 16 images is actually closest to the original stimulus that we want to reconstruct. So we can think of this a little bit like the model is reasoning, right? It's thinking through a bunch of possible options and that it is picking the best one of those options according to some information that it has. And then the last thing our model does is it uses one of these embeddings to also generate a caption, to just describe what was happening in the original image and produce sort of a multimodal output that might be helpful for interpretability. So that was a lot, but we have a model now, so we can test it. We first will apply it to sort of those vision trials that were established as a baseline in our data set. And we see some very interesting stuff. So they look, for the most part, great, which means our model is working. But we also maybe notice that the scene simple stimuli, the oriented bars and crosses, are more distinct than they were for other methods. This is a consequence of our image filters that we apply to that structure. Our model is pulling out more structure than a lot of these methods typically do, which might help us when we do mental images that typically have less structure baked into them. As for imagery results, I have the full grid, but again, this is very hard to see, so maybe we can zoom in a little bit. These are some of the best reconstructions across all of those stimulus types that we were looking at before. You have the simple, the complex, and the conceptual. As for simple, we see very strong orientational features here. I mean, even the X, which we were missing with other models, are now producing 4 identical zebra heads that are sort of positioned in the corners of the image, such the fact that it makes an X. Which is very interesting. It means that while, again, the semantic information that it's pulling out for these simple stimuli is somewhat nonsensical and meaningless, the structure that we really care about in these simple stimuli is being decoded. And it's a similar story for the sort of horizontal and vertical lines. We see, again, sort of random objects, but they're positioned very distinctly to match the orientation of the object we care about. For complex stimuli, we are making progress, right? The surfer is now a snowboarder as opposed to sort of a very distorted skier, I think the previous one was. So that's quite a bit closer. And the bird now has wings. That's about all I'll say about that one. And of course, we now have 2 more donut-looking pastries. So again, this is not perfect, but we are certainly getting closer to the true content encoded in brain activity here. And even for the conceptual stimuli, we are getting much clearer reconstructions. We have a very distinguishable zebra now. The banana looks a lot more like a banana. And our stripes are very distinct. So we've clearly made progress, I think, qualitatively just looking at these. And we can also evaluate that quantitatively, where we did the same experiment we talked about before, where we had people pick one of two images that might be closer to try and identify which was the actual reconstruction. And I know tables on slides are annoying to read, but the main thing being that for mental image reconstructions, our model is doing better than everything else we tested against by a significant margin. So it's producing reconstructions that are better. They're more identifiable, they're higher fidelity, they're more qualitatively similar. And even for seen images, which is not necessarily what our method was designed for, we're still producing reasonably strong performance. Looking at the similarity score analysis from that second behavioral experiment that we did before, we can make the same kind of plot, but now it has a new red line on it. And we see that that red line corresponding to the generalization between seen and mental images is now of a higher slope, right? Which means we have improved. We have lowered the gap between the seen and mental image reconstruction quality and produce reconstructions that not only are state-of-the-art, but they are generalizing better between these modalities. So looking at the conceptual stimuli, though, these are still sort of putting a pin in our hat. We wanted to know, like, I can look at the conceptual stimuli and say that looks like more like stripes, but it is hard to tell whether they are actually better, both because we don't know what the true mental image was, but also because there is no ground truth sort of stimulus to even compare to if we wanted to sort of infer what the true mental image was. So one of the ways we might be able to do that is to perform a similarity score experiment like we did before, but instead of comparing mental images and seen images, we can just compare two mental image reconstructions from different methods. So in other words, the question we are asking is not what is the difference between seen and mental image reconstructions, but what is the difference between two particular methods when they are both producing mental image reconstructions of a target concept. So would human raters agree that one method better approximates a concept than another method? And we did this across all sort of pairwise combinations of methods that we were evaluating. And we get sort of a head-to-head of the conceptual stimuli reconstruction performance. So if you want to sort of do this with me in your head, you can sort of imagine where on this field of confidence and similarity you might place these. But at least for me, I think I would put the one on the left a little bit higher because the stripes are more clearly distinguished. So we would get maybe something like that. And this is how we're going to measure the difference between methods. We're going to take the difference on the similarity axis, the y-axis here, and we're going to compare the difference, the average difference between different methods on that performance. Okay, so we can plot all of this data in a very fancy star plot. This star plot is displaying the stimulus or the similarity score advantage between all method combinations. So what we're really looking for in this plot is the area of this polygon. The red polygon in this case corresponds to Mirage, and every one of the radial x-axes is Mirage's similarity score advantage against a different method. And then all of the other polygons are the relative advantage for the other methods as well. So the fact that the red polygon is the biggest one is great news. It means that if you ask human raters to evaluate sort of how similar our reconstructions were to those target concepts, they will say that Mirage's reconstructions were closer than every other method we tested on average. So all of that is answering sort of our first question, which is, can we do better? And I think the answer is clearly that we can. Mirage provides a significant improvement sort of across all the metrics we evaluated, and also just qualitatively, if we look at the reconstructions, I think we can describe that there's a clear improvement. But looking a little bit deeper, we want to really know, why is it better? And what decisions that we made were truly the most impactful? And where might future research in this field want to go as well? So this is what we like to call machine learning an ablation plot. In other words, if we take various parts of our model and we remove it, and we see how the model does without this critical piece, we can sort of evaluate how important all of these different bits and bobs are to the final performance that we just measured. So in this case, the plot is a little bit different. So instead of using human data, we're going to use the data provided by a suite of image similarity metrics. So these are things like comparing the correlation of the actual pixels, where we can compare the similarity of the images in the like clip semantic space, and a variety of other metrics that aren't necessarily important, but bigger is better, obviously. And we have performance on the y-axis to be the performance on the imagery trials, and the x-axis to be performance on the vision trials. So we can explore in this plot sort of the dynamic of all of our different model architecture pieces. So first, that low-level model, the VAE, the thing that provides all of the structure to our method. The blue dots in this case correspond to variants where we messed with this part of our architecture. The bottom left dot, this 3 right here, is what happens if you just remove it entirely. It's obviously much worse. but also our sort of filtering operation to boost the contrast to bring out more of the structure. If you remove that aspect, you go down to this 2 dot and you hurt performance primarily just on imagery trials. In other words, the performance of these models are being impacted by us sort of boosting the contrast to pull out more of the structure. Imagery data doesn't have very much structure, and so that operation sort of helps bring it back a little bit. Looking at other things, that retrieval module that we mentioned that sort of generates a set of candidates and then picks the best one. We can see from the orange dot, which is a little hard to see here, this number 4, that's a pretty big boost in our performance. The type of the captions that we use to increase the quality of our sort of high-level text semantic information that our model is decoding is also important. We see that generating longer and longer of these synthetic captions with our vision language model actually does a lot to help performance and improve sort of the quality of that training data. So the green dots are also improving. And I think one of the more important aspects that we learn in this ablation is that the features that you use as your intermediate embeddings, remember we talked about how we were decoding a smaller, sort of lower ceiling, easier to decode embedding than something like MindEye2 was. If you switch the type of feature that you decode, this appears to have a huge impact on performance. Some models do pretty well, like a model called versatile diffusion, which is the one used in Brain Diffuser, is pretty close to ours, but for the most part, the models used in MindEye2 do very badly on this task, and we can sort of identify that as a key driver of why MindEye2 and other models like it will fail on this data. The other thing we looked at was whether the alignment of our information to the mental image data matters, whether the fact that we're using both images and text as our training data to sort of capture some of those higher level semantics. We evaluated whether that was an important choice. So we called it the guidance modality, right? Is it learning image information? Is it learning text information? Is it learning both? And what we see is that image is better than text, but using both is better than either one on its own. And the last thing we evaluated was the importance of our what we call the backbone architecture. So what type of model is being used to decode this? Remember, we're using a linear model for Mirage, and we chose that because of its simplicity, its robustness to the shift in data representation. And we wanted to say whether that was an important choice as to whether the model is effectively generalizing from scene to mental images. And what we found was that yes, all of the pink dots which sort of span the bottom left of this plot are different architectures that are used in other scene image reconstruction methods, some from MindEye2 and MindEye1 and other models. And if you replace our linear backbone with any of those, you get drastic drops in performance. So it appears that robustness to the sort of the underlying data quality issue that is inherent in recording mental imagery data is one of the most important factors that we can do in designing a mental image decoding model that is effective and translates that domain effectively. So that was a lot, but it answers our second question of which of these pieces are actually most important. I think it's very obvious that sort of that simple, robust decoding backbone is one of the most important pieces, and also our multimodal features and sort of the size of these image embeddings are also very important in terms of maximizing performance on mental images. So now we can ask an interesting science question. Does this natural diffusion prior actually help with our reconstructions? We saw earlier that some of our reconstructions were from the simple stimuli and sort of all of the natural details get completely hallucinated, but for the images where those natural details actually help for the complex stimuli, how much of that prior should we use in our reconstructions? How much of it should actually be pulled from the brain and how much should be sort of helped along by this diffusion model? So we can control this and experiment with it through a parameter in the diffusion model called the strength. So you can think of this as how much smoothing should the generator do to the information that it is given to produce an image that sort of looks like a real image. And so if you turn the strength down, you sort of get closer and closer to the core embedding that is produced in your VAE that you decoded, your structure. And the more of the strength that you include, the more of the image is now being pulled, not from the sort of structural embedding that you gave it, but it is now being pulled from both its natural prior and also from the semantic information in sort of the clip representation that you gave it. So if you gave it a clip information vector that contained cats, then it will trend more and more towards producing sort of arbitrary cats instead of maybe the specific cat that you wanted. So looking at the performance of our models as we changed this strength parameter to sort of ask the question of how much of this prior, how much of the balance between structure and semantics really matters. What we did is we conducted a human identification accuracy experiment. So that's the first one where we just ask humans to pick which image is closer or more identifiable. And we asked them to rate reconstructions across the whole parameter window of strength. So how identifiable were the reconstructions if your strength is low versus how identifiable were they if your strength is high on the right side. And we evaluated that both for the imagery and vision trials, but also as a control, we took the ground truth stimulus images and we extracted the sort of the correct embeddings, right? If our model was decoding perfect embeddings and then just generating them back into images, what would our ceiling be? And so obviously if your image information is perfect, the blue line, then you want to do as little generating as possible because you only get further from the true answer. So you get this sort of logarithmic curve that as your strength increases, you get closer and closer to chance. The other lines here for the imagery and vision trials, they sort of have a very interesting slope in that they both trend down. In other words, the more of the diffusion's natural prior that you apply, the less and less identifiable your reconstructions are getting. In other words, the core question of is the fact that the diffusion model is hallucinating all of this natural image detail, is it helping you? Is it making image reconstructions any better? I think the answer is clearly no, or at least that it is not a strong effect in terms of how identifiable these images are. And what that tells us, I think, is that the generator is playing an important role here, clearly. It's refining the reconstructions, it's making them look like real images, it's making us happy as researchers because it looks more like donuts rather than sort of some arbitrary shapes. But as far as the reconstruction quality, the identification accuracy, how much information does it convey, adding that smoothing generally doesn't help, but it also sort of, up to a point, it doesn't provide significant performance drop-offs. So what we take away from this, or at least what I took away from this as researchers, is that the one interpretation of the results is just that your model is hallucinating pretty images and you say, wow, it's working. And I don't think that interpretation is correct because the pretty images are not what's making it work. And while they are fun to look at, the result here I think is still that we are pulling information from brain activity and we are inverting it into meaningful representations that convey that underlying content. So that answers our sort of scientific question here about what that role of this prior is. So it's clearly providing a lot of aesthetic and subjective similarity benefits, but it's not helping humans identify the images any more accurately. So the last question, which is a little bit more forward-looking of this plot, is how limiting is the quantity of your vision training data for establishing these models, right? The only reason any of this is possible is because we have a massive corpus of humans that are seeing images under fMRI, right? Each of these subjects was in the scanner for up to 40 hours over the course of a year to collect all of this data. The cost of that data set racked up almost $450,000 in research resources, right? So collecting more of this data is expensive, it's time consuming, and it's difficult. And the question I think underlying all of this research is, how much more of that do we need to do? Is it worth throwing money at the problem to sort of expand the size of vision decoding data sets such that we will get closer to solving this underlying research problem? Or have we sort of saturated it and maybe our efforts are better spent? So we can look at this in the context of data scale. So what we've done here is we've taken the suite of models that we've been evaluating them, and we trained them on subsets of the natural scenes data set before doing inference on mental imagery. And what we find is that as you increase the amount of training data, the scaling performance of your models is actually drastically different depending on the architecture you use. So for example, these the blue and purple dots are the MindEye 1 and 2 methods, which are using that complex deep learning backbone that is not necessarily robust to a lot of the data drops or data signal quality drops in mental imagery data. We don't see hardly any scaling performance. I mean, the purple dot here sort of bounces around and then plummets to the ground, right? You're not improving as you add more and more vision training data if your model is overfitting to vision.
That's the number of hours, right?
The number of hours is the numbers in the plot.
Is the number in the little
circle.
So
they're generally connected in order, but the number of hours is not on either of the axes. The axes are vision and imagery performance. So yeah, what we see for MindEye 2 is that it plummets. For MindEye 1, which is the blue dots, it sort of bounces up and then only goes over to the right. In the sense that as you add more vision training data, you only get better on vision, not imagery. But the promising thing that we see here is that if you take the models that use that more robust linear transformation to do our decoding work, the brain diffuser method and our Mirage method, you get a much more encouraging sign in that as you increase the quantity of data, you have an increasing slope of this plot. In other words, as you add more data, you're not only improving on vision reconstruction, your models are also continuing to generalize to imagery. So the red dot here is mirage, and the green one is brain diffuser, and we see both that they have sort of an increasing slope, and also that we have not yet hit the plateau of what the ceiling for these models are in terms of how much data they're trained on. The last thing that I want you to take away from this plot is also that the effectiveness of these models as far as they scale is drastically different. So we can think of that as the slope of if you were to fit a line to these collections of points, how efficient is the model at utilizing low amounts of data to produce high quality reconstructions. And also what we see in that sense is that mirage, our red line, is the most data efficient method in that with only sort of 3 hours of fMRI data, which is this dot here, we are doing better or equal to any other method trained on any amount of data. So that is less than 10% of the total size of the natural scenes data set, that if you train on only 10% of it, you can outperform every other method just through the better design of the architecture. But yeah, I think the other takeaway from this plot is that we have not saturated. We can collect more vision data, and presuming that our models are able to generalize across this data quality gap, we will continue to see scaling benefits as we continue to invest more resources in collecting these very large vision decoding data sets. The other question we asked is about a detail that I haven't really talked about in this plot yet, which is that to establish these reconstructions during the inference phase, we're not just taking sort of one pattern of brain activity and passing it through the models. What we actually do is we have subjects sit in the scanner, and then they imagine the image, and then they stop imagining it, and then they imagine some other image. And then maybe 5 minutes later, they imagine it again. And then they do that 16 times, and then you have 16 of these patterns of brain activity that all correspond to them imagining the same image. And then what we do to actually do inference on these models is we average all of those patterns of brain activity together. So what does that do? It amplifies all of the parts of the signal that were actually meaningfully correspondent to the image they were imagining, and it sort of suppresses all of the information that was just random variation between all of the trials. Brain activity, especially for mental imagery, is incredibly noisy. So this is a step that very much helps amplify the signal to noise ratio in the data that our models are trying to reconstruct. So the question we're asking in this analysis is how much does that matter, right? In the future, we might want to do this with only single trial recordings, right? It might be very hard to have someone record multiple repetitions of the same thing they're trying to convey. So if you could do it with only one pattern, that would be very helpful. But what we see in this analysis is actually that this is an incredibly important step still. The x-axis on this plot is the number of repetitions that are averaged across during inference, and the y-axis is the performance of these models. In this case, imagery and vision are separated by the dashed and dotted lines. So dotted is imagery, solid and dashed lines. So imagery is the dashed line on the bottom, and vision is the solid lines on top. So what we see is that every model improves as you average across more and more trial repetitions, which is expected. But also that the rate at which the trial repetitions matters is a little bit different between methods. So some methods need more trial averaging than others. And what we also see is that methods like mirage and the red lines generally benefit more from this increased signal quality. They are translating better to these both higher and lower numbers of trial repetitions and are sort of increased on the y-axis of this plot. But the last takeaway, I think, for especially practical deployments of this technology is that if you go down to one repetition, your models do pretty bad, at least for imagery. And so it's clear that there's a lot of work to do, both on the hardware side of can we increase the signal of the mental image patterns of brain activity that we're recording, if we want to have this ever be sort of practical in downstream use cases. But also that there is, I think, machine learning work to be done on pulling more of the data or more of the signal out from that data when you don't have this sort of crutch to lean on of the multi-trial averaging procedure. So that answers the last question of this talk, which is that the data is still a huge constraint in this research. We're certainly making tons of progress with data sets like the natural scenes data set and NSD imagery into allowing this research to even be possible in the first place. But we're a ways away from sort of incorporating a novel subject into our data, right? You have a new subject that you don't have 40 hours of data on. You need the model to work on their brain. We're a ways away from that working. And we're also a ways away from single trial decoding efforts where you might not want someone to repeat the same image several times in order to be able to reconstruct their mental images. So as for those goals, there's plenty of work to be done still. But to sort of conclude my talk, I'm sure everyone in the audience today can think of a million applications for this technology, both good and bad. I think in the context of this research, I'm certainly thinking about how it might be used in the clinic. There's 50 million traumatic brain injury patients who are unresponsive in the ICU every year. We talked about that. And a recovery of consciousness and even an identifier of consciousness is a key milestone that predicts recovery for those patients. So potentially in cases like medicine and clinical tech, where we have access to fMRI scanners, we maybe have access to get lots of repetitions, and we can do we could take steps to overcome some of the data boundaries and data limitations that we talked about. I think there's practical utility for this technology in that field. But of course, there's obviously many limitations to making that happen. NSD imagery is an extremely small data set relative to all of the training corpuses, like the natural scenes data set, the core vision data set. So we obviously need to collect more imagery data, we need to collect more vision data, we need to improve performance through data scale. But we also need to develop better experimental protocols. We talked at the beginning of the seminar about how important your experimental protocol is for collecting mental images, as just that it's very hard for humans to conjure tens of thousands of mental images at a time in an experiment. And so we need better protocols that make that easier for the subject. It means we can get more of them in a shorter span of time, and to just make sure that the data is high quality on that front. That's one of the biggest limiters in collecting large mental imagery data sets. But we also need to do work on developing the machine learning models that can translate brain activity patterns between subjects. This is one of the core things that the MindEye2 architecture that I helped contribute to was aiming for. The core contribution of that model, that paper, was that on vision data sets, you could adapt one of these models to a new subject with as little as 1 hour of data, which is obviously a huge step from 40 hours. But we saw in this work that the sort of complex architecture of that model doesn't translate nearly at all to mental images. So future work is sort of still necessary there to bridge these two sort of narrowly related research directions. But yeah, with all that said, I think this is an incredibly promising and exciting area of research. And I'd also like to thank the authors of all of the various publications whose methods we reproduced on this data set, and also all of the other authors that contributed to papers that I authored as well. So it was definitely a collaborative effort for much of this research, and you should check out all of their work too if you're interested. So that's all I have in terms of research for you today. I maybe talked a little bit about this talk about how I was up at 6 a.m. this morning, sort of accepting shipping boxes to move across the country to San Francisco. And that's an exciting step for me. I am moving at the end of the month to go work on AllJoined with my longtime friend and collaborator, Jonathan. We're going to try and build brain-computer interfaces with EEG, which is a much more portable and sort of affordable scanning methodology. We just yesterday submitted 2 papers to the Neural Information Processing Systems Conference, which are trying to establish a lot of these methods that currently work on scene images with fMRI. We've been trying to translate them to EEG with systems that, instead of costing $7 million, they maybe cost $2,000, right? And so that's a lot of what is next for me, is I'm going to go try and bring a lot of this technology into the real world, to use more accessible modalities, and also to try and make a difference in more people's lives. So with that said, that's all for me today. I'd like to thank everyone for listening, and at this time I can take any questions as well.